Welcome to this compilation of 4 dystopian sci-fi short stories. I'll be narrating The Blue Tower by Evelyn E. Smith, Sales Resistance by Henry Still, Perchance to Dream by Richard Stockham, and Shatter the Wall by Sydney van Scyoc. If you like this kind of story and want more, why not consider signing up to my Patreon? There you can listen to a range of exclusive novelettes, get 6-month early access to novels I narrate like Death World by Harry Harrison, and enjoy ad-free audio and video versions of all stories. Head to patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF, link in the description if you're interested. And now's a good time to thank my current Patreons who are growing in number. Thanks for being awesome, and also thank you to those who will sign up in the future. But now let's get on with the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Blue Tower by Evelyn E. Smith, narrated by William Sky. As the vastly advanced guardians of mankind, the Belphins knew how to make a lesson stick. But whom? Ludovic Eversole sat in the golden sunshine outside his house, writing a poem as he watched the street flow gently past him. There were very few people on it, for he lived in a slow part of town, and those who went in for travel generally preferred streets where the pace was quicker. Moreover, on a sultry spring afternoon like this one, there would be few people wandering abroad. Most would be lying on sun-kissed white beaches or in sun-drenched parks, or for those who did not fancy being either kissed or drenched by the sun, basking in the comfort of their own air-conditioned villas. Some would, like Ludovic, be writing poems, others composing symphonies, still others painting pictures. Those who were without creative talent or the inclination to indulge it would be relaxing their well-kept golden bodies in whatever surroundings they had chosen to spend this particular one of the perfect days that stretched in an unbroken line before every member of the human race from the cradle to the crematorium. Only the Belphins were much in evidence. Only the Belphins had duties to perform. Only the Belphins worked. Ludovic stretched his own well-kept golden body and rejoiced in the knowing that he was a man and not a Belphin. Immediately afterward he was sorry for the heartless thought. Didn't the Belphins work only to serve humanity? How ungrateful then it was to gloat over them. Besides, he comforted himself, probably, if the truth were known, the Belphins liked to work. He hailed a passing Belphin for assurance on this point. Courteous, like all members of his species, the creature leaped from the street and listened attentively to the young man's questions. "We Belphins have but one like and one dislike," he replied. "We like what is right, and we dislike what is wrong." "But how can you tell what is right and what is wrong?" Ludovic persisted. "We know," the Belphin said, gazing reverently across the city to the blue spire of the tower where the Belphin of Belphins dwelt, in constant communication with every member of his race at all times, or so they said. "That is why we were placed in charge of humanity. Some day you too may advance to the point where you know, and we shall return whence we came." "But who placed you in charge?" Ludovic asked. "And whence did you come?" Fearing he might seem motivated by vulgar curiosity, he explained, "I am doing research for an epic poem." A lifetime spent under their gentle guardianship had made Ludovic able to interpret the expression that flitted across this Belphin's frontispiece as a sad, sweet smile. "We come from beyond the stars," he said. Ludovic already knew that. He had hoped for something a little more specific. "We were placed in power by those who had the right, and the power through which we rule is the power of love. Be happy." And with that conventional farewell, which also served as a greeting, he stepped onto the sidewalk and was borne off. Ludovic looked after him pensively for a moment, then shrugged. Why should the Belfins surrender their secrets to gratify the idle curiosity of a poet? Ludovic packed his portable scriptwriter in its case and went to call on the girl next door, whom he loved with a deep and intermittently requited passion. As he passed between the tall columns leading into the Flockhart courtyard, he noted with regret that there were quite a number of Khorasan's relatives present, lying about sunning themselves and sipping beverages which probably touched the legal limit of intoxicatability. Much as he hated to think harshly of anyone, he did not like Khorasan Flockhart's relatives. He had never known anybody who had as many relatives as she did, and sometimes he suspected they were not all related to her. Then he would dismiss the thought as unworthy of him or any right-thinking human being. He loved Khorasan for herself alone, and not for her family. Whether they were actually her family or not was none of his business. "Be happy," he greeted the assemblage cordially, sitting down beside Khorasan on the tessellated pavement. "Bah!" said old Osmond Flockhart, Khorasan's grandfather. Ludovic was sure that underneath his crustiness the gnarled patriarch hid a heart of gold. Although he had been mining assiduously, the young man had not yet been able to strike that vein. However, he did not give up hope, for not giving up hope was one of the principles that his wise old Belfin teacher had inculcated in him. Other principles were to lead the good life and keep healthy. "Now, grandfather," Khorasan said, "no matter what your politics, that does not excuse impoliteness." Ludovic wished she would not allude so blatantly to politics, because he had a lurking notion that Khorasan's family was in fact a band of conspirators, such as still dotted the green and pleasant planet and proved by their existence that man was not advancing anywhere within measurable distance of that totality of knowledge implied by the Belfin. You could tell malcontents, even if they did not voice their dissatisfactions, by their faces. The vast majority of the human race, living good and happy lives, had smooth and pleasant faces. Malcontents' faces were lined and sometimes, in extreme cases, furrowed. Everyone could easily tell who they were by looking at them, and most people avoided them. It was not that griping was illegal, for the Belfins permitted free speech and reasonable conspiracy. It was that such behaviour was considered ungenteel. Ludovic would never have dreamed of associating with this set of neighbours once he had discovered their tendencies, had he not lost his heart to the purple-eyed Khorasan of their first meeting. "Politeness, bah!" old Osmond said. "To see a healthy young man simply accepting the status quo." "If the status quo is a good status quo," Ludovic said uneasily, for he did not like to discuss such subjects, "why should I not accept it? We have everything we could possibly want. What do we lack?" "Our freedom," Osmond retorted. "But we are free," Ludovic said, perplexed. "We can say what we like, do what we like, so long as it is consonant with the public good." "Ah, but who determines what is consonant with the public good?" Ludovic could no longer temporize with truth, even for Khorasan's sake. "Look here, old man, I have read books. I know about the old days before the Belfins came from the stars. Men were destroying themselves quickly through wars, or slowly through want. There is none of that anymore." "All lies and exaggeration," old Osmond said. "My grandfather told me that when the Belfins took over Earth, they rewrote all the textbooks to suit their own purposes. Now nothing but Belfin propaganda is taught in the schools." "But surely some of what they teach about the past must be true," Ludovic insisted. "And today every one of us has enough to eat and drink, a place to live, beautiful garments to wear, and all the time in the world to utilize as he chooses in all sorts of pleasant activities. What is missing?" "They've taken away our frontiers." Behind his back, Khorasan made a little filial face at Ludovic. Ludovic tried to make the old man see reason. "But I'm happy, and everybody is happy, except, except a few killjoys like you." "They certainly did a good job of brainwashing you, boy," Osmond sighed. "And of most of the young ones," he added mournfully. "With each succeeding generation, more of our heritage is lost." He patted the girl's hand. "You're a good girl, Corrie. You don't hold with this being cared for like some damn pet poodle." "Never mind Osmond, Eversoul," one of Coruscant's alleged uncles grinned. "He talks a lot, but of course he doesn't mean a quarter of what he says. Come, have some wine." He handed a glass to Ludovic. Ludovic sipped and coughed. It tasted as if it were well above the legal alcohol limit, but he didn't like to say anything. They were taking an awful risk, though, doing a thing like that. If they got caught, they might receive a public scolding, which was, of course, no more than they deserved, but he could not bear to think of Coruscant exposed to such an ordeal. "It's only reasonable," the uncle went on, "that older people should have a thing about being governed by foreigners." Ludovic smiled and set his nearly full glass down on a plinth. "You could hardly call the Belphins foreigners. They've been on Earth longer than even the oldest of us." "You seem to be pretty chummy with them," the uncle said, looking narrow-eyed at Ludovic. "No more so than any other loyal citizen," Ludovic replied. The uncle sat up and wrapped his arms around his thick, bare legs. He was a powerful, hairy brute of a creature who had not taken advantage of the numerous cosmetic techniques offered by the benevolent Belphins. "Don't you think it's funny they can breathe our air so easily?" "Why shouldn't they?" Ludovic bit into an apple that Coruscant handed him from one of the dishes of fruit and other delicacies strewn about the courtyard. "It's excellent air," he continued through a full mouth, "especially now that it's all purified. I understand that in the old days—" "Yes," the uncle said, "but don't you think it's a coincidence they breathe exactly the same kind of air we do, considering they claim to come from another solar system?" "No coincidence at all," said Ludovic shortly, no longer able to pretend he didn't know what the other was getting at. He had heard the ugly rumour before. Of course, sacrilege was not illegal, but it was in bad taste. "Only one combination of elements spawns intelligent life." "They say," the uncle continued, impervious to Ludovic's unconcealed dislike for the subject, "that there's really only one Belphin who lives in the Blue Tower, in a tank or something, because he can't breathe our atmosphere, and that the others are a sort of robot he sends out to do his work for him." "Nonsense!" Ludovic was goaded to irritation at last. "How could a robot have that delicate play of expression, that subtle economy of movement?" Coruscant and the uncle exchanged glances. "But they are absolutely blank," the uncle began hesitantly. "Perhaps with your rich, poetic imagination—" "See," old Osmond remarked with satisfaction. "The kid's brainwashed. I told you so." "Even if the Belphin is a single entity," Ludovic went on, "that doesn't necessarily make him less benevolent." He was again interrupted by the grandfather. "I won't listen to any more of this twaddle. Benevolent, bah! He or she or it or them is or are just plain exploiting us, taking our mineral resources away. I've seen 'em loading ore on the spaceships and exchanging it for other resources from the stars," Ludovic said tightly, "without which we could not have the perfectly balanced society we have today, without which we would be technologically back in the dark ages from which they rescued us. It's not the stuff they bring in from outside that runs this technology," the uncle said. "It's some power they've got that we can't seem to figure out. Though Lord knows we've tried," he added musingly. "Of course they have their own source of power," Ludovic informed them, smiling to himself, for his old Belphin teacher had taken great care to instill a sense of humour into him. "A Belphin was explaining that to me only today." 20 heads swivelled toward him. He felt uncomfortable, for he was a modest young man and did not like to be the cynosure of all eyes. "Tell us, dear boy," the uncle said, grabbing Ludovic's glass from the plinth and filling it. "What exactly did he say?" "He said the Belphins rule through the power of love." The glass crashed to the tesserie as the uncle uttered a very unworthy word. "And I suppose it was love that killed Mieczysław and George when they tried to storm the Blue Tower," old Osmond began, then halted at the looks he was getting from everybody. Ludovic could no longer pretend his neighbours were a group of eccentrics whom he himself was eccentric enough to regard as charming. "So," he stood up and wrapped his mantle about him, "I knew you were against the government, and of course you have a legal right to disagree with its policies, but I didn't think you were actual, he dredged a word up out of his school days. Anarchists?" He turned to the girl who was looking thoughtful as she stroked the glittering jewel that always hung at her neck. "Coruscant, how can you stay with these—" he found another word, "these subversives?" She smiled sadly. "Don't forget they're my family, Ludovic, and I owe them dutiful respect, no matter how pig-headed they are." She pressed his hand. "But don't give up hope." That rang a bell inside his brain. "I won't," he vowed, giving her hand a return squeeze. "I promise I won't." Outside the Flockhart villa, he paused, struggling with his inner self. It was an unworthy thing to inform upon one's neighbours. On the other hand, could he stand idly by and let those neighbours attempt to destroy the social order? Deciding that the greater good was the more important, and that, moreover, it was the only way of taking Coruscant away from all this, he went in search of a Belphin. That is, he waited until one glided past and called to him to leave the walk. "I wish to report a conspiracy at number 7 Mimosa Lane," he said. "The girl is innocent, but the others are in it to the hilt." The Belphin appeared to think for a minute. Then he gave off a smile. "Oh, them," he said. "We know. They are harmless." "Harmless?" Ludovic repeated. "Why, I understand they've already tried to attack the Blue Tower by force." "Quite. And failed. For we are protected from hostile forces, as you were told earlier, by the power of love." Ludovic knew, of course, that the Belphin used the word love metaphorically, that the tower was protected by a series of highly efficient barriers of force to repel attackers, barriers which, he realized now from the sad fate of Mieczysław and George, were potentially lethal. However, he did not blame the Belphin for being so cagey about his race's source of power, not with people like the Flockharts running about subverting and whatnot. "You certainly do have a wonderful intercommunication system," he murmured. "Everything about us is wonderful," the Belphin said non-committally. "That's why we're so good to you people. Be happy." And he was off. But Ludovic could not be happy. He wasn't precisely sad yet, but he was thoughtful. Of course, the Belphins knew better than he did, but still, perhaps they underestimated the seriousness of the Flockhart conspiracy. On the other hand, perhaps it was he who was taking the Flockharts too seriously. Maybe he should investigate further before doing anything rash. Later that night, he slipped over to the Flockhart villa and nosed about in the courtyard until he found the window behind which the family was conspiring. He peered through a chink in the curtains so he could both see and hear. Coruscant was saying, "And so I think there is a lot in what Ludovic said." Bless her, he thought emotionally. Even in the midst of her plotting, she had time to spare a kind word for him. And then it hit him. She, too, was a plotter. "You suggest that we try to turn the power of love against the Belphins?" the uncle asked ironically. Coruscant gave a rippling laugh as she twirled her glittering pendant. "In a manner of speaking," she said, "I have an idea for a secret weapon which might do the trick." At that moment, Ludovic stumbled over a jug which some careless relative had apparently left lying about the courtyard. It crashed to the tesserie, spattering Ludovic's legs and sandals with a liquid which later proved to be extremely red wine. "There's someone outside," the uncle declared, half rising. "Nonsense," Khorasan said, putting her hand on his shoulder. "I didn't hear anything." The uncle looked dubious, and Ludovic thought it prudent to withdraw at this point. Besides, he had heard enough. Khorasan, his Khorasan, was an integral part of the conspiracy. He lay down to sleep that night, beset by doubts. If he told the Belfins about the conspiracy, he would be betraying Khorasan. As a matter of fact, he now remembered, he had already told them about the conspiracy and they hadn't believed him. But supposing he could convince them, how could he give Khorasan up to them? True, it was the right thing to do, but for the first time in his life he could not bring himself to do what he knew to be right. He was weak, and weakness was sinful. His old Belfin teacher had taught him that too. As Ludovic writhed restlessly upon his bed, he became aware that someone had come into his chamber. "Ludovic," a soft, beloved voice whispered, "I have come to ask your help." It was so dark he could not see her. He knew where she was only by the glitter of the jewel on her neck chain as it arced through the blackness. "Khorasan," he breathed. "Ludovic," she sighed. Now that the amenities were over, she resumed. "Against my will, I have been involved in the family plot. My uncle has invented a secret weapon which he believes will counteract the power of the barriers. But I thought you devised it." "So it was you in the courtyard. Well, what happened was I wanted to gain time, so I said I had a secret weapon of my own invention which I had not perfected, but which would cost considerably less than my uncle's model. We have to watch the budget, you know, because we can hardly expect the Belfins to supply the components for this job. Anyhow, I thought that while my folks were waiting for me to finish it, you would have a chance to warn the Belfins." "Khorasan," he murmured, "you are as noble and clever as you are beautiful." Then he caught the full import of her remarks. "Me? But they won't pay any attention to me." "How do you know?" When he remained silent, she said, "I suppose you've already tried to warn them about us." I said you had nothing to do with the plot." "That was good of you," she continued in a warmer tone. "How many Belfins did you warn, then?" "Just one. When you tell one something, you tell them all. You know that. Everyone knows that." "That's just theory," she said. "It's never been proven. All we do know is that they have some sort of central clearinghouse of information, presumably the Belfin of Belfins. But we don't know that they are incapable of thinking or acting individually. We don't really know much about them at all. They're very secretive." "Aloof," he corrected her, "as befits a ruling race, but always affable." "You must warn as many Belfins as you can." "And if none listens to me?" "Then," she said dramatically, "you must approach the Belfin of Belfins himself." "But no human being has ever come near him," he said plaintively. "You know that all those who have tried perished. And that can't be a rumour because your grandfather said, but they came to attack the Belfin. You're coming to warn him. That makes a big difference. Ludovic." She took his hand in hers. In the darkness, the jewel swung madly on her presumably heaving bosom. "This is bigger than both of us. It's for Earth." He knew it was his patriotic duty to do as she said. Still, he had enjoyed life so much. "Khorasan, wouldn't it be much simpler if we just destroyed your uncle's secret weapon?" "He'd only make another. Don't you see, Ludovic, this is our only chance to save the Belfins, to save humanity. But of course, I don't have the right to send you. I'll go myself." "No, Khorasan," he sighed. "I can't let you go. I'll do it." Next morning, he set out to warn Belfins. He knew it wasn't much use, but it was all he could do. The first half-dozen responded in much the same way the Belfin he had warned the previous day had done, by courteously acknowledging his solicitude and assuring him there was no need for alarm. They knew all about the Flockharts and everything would be all right. After that, they started to get increasingly huffy, which would, he thought, substantiate the theory that they were all part of one vast coordinate network of identity. Especially since each Belfin behaved as if Ludovic had been repeatedly annoying him. Finally, they refused to get off the walks when he hailed them, which was unheard of, for no Belfin had ever before failed to respond to an Earthman's call, and when he started running along the walks after them, they ran much faster than he could. At last he gave up and wandered about the city for hours, speaking to neither human nor Belfin, wondering what to do. That is, he knew what he had to do, he was wondering how to do it. He would never be able to reach the Belfin of Belfins. No human being had ever done it. Mieczysław and George had died trying to reach him, or it. Even though their intentions had been hostile and Ludovic's would be helpful, there was little chance he would be allowed to reach the Belfin with all the other Belfins against him. What guarantee was there that the Belfin would not be against him too? And yet he knew that he would have to risk his life. There was no help for it. He had never wanted to be a hero, and here he had heroism thrust upon him. He knew he could not succeed. Equally well, he knew he could not turn back, for his Belfin teacher had instructed him in the meaning of duty. It was twilight when he approached the Blue Tower. Commending himself to the infinite virtue, he entered. The Belfin at the reception desk did not give off the customary smiling expression. In fact, he seemed to radiate a curiously apprehensive aura. "Go back, young man," he said. "You're not wanted here." "I must see the Belfin of Belfins. I must warn him against the Flockharts." "He has been warned," the receptionist told him. "Go home and be happy." "I don't trust you or your brothers. I must see the Belfin himself." Suddenly, this particular Belfin lost his commanding manners. He began to wilt, insofar as so rigidly constructed a creature could go limp. "Please, we've done so much for you. Do this for us." "The Belfin of Belfins did things for us," Ludovic countered. "You are all only his followers. How do I know you are really following him? How do I know you haven't turned against him?" Without giving the creature a chance to answer, he strode forward. The Belfin attempted to bar his way. Ludovic knew one Belfin was a myriad times as strong as a human, so it was out of utter futility that he struck. The Belfin collapsed completely, flying apart in a welter of fragile springs and gears. The fact was of some deeper significance, Ludovic knew, but he was too numbed by his incredible success to be able to think clearly. All he knew was that the Belfin would be able to explain things to him. Bells began to clash and clang. That meant the force barriers had gone up. He could see the shimmering insubstance of the first one before him. Squaring his shoulders, he charged it, and walked right through. He looked himself up and down. He was alive and entire. Then the whole thing was a fraud. The barriers were not lethal, or perhaps even actual. But what of Mieczysław? And George? And countless rumoured others? He would not let himself even try to think of them. He would not let himself even try to think of anything save his duty. A staircase spiralled up ahead of him. A Belfin was at its foot. Behind him, a barrier iridesced. "Please, young man," the Belfin began. "You don't understand. Let me explain." But Ludovic destroyed the thing before it could say anything further, and he passed right through the barrier. He had to get to the top and warn the Belfin of Belfins, whoever or whatever he or it was, that the Flockharts had a secret weapon which might be able to annihilate it or him. Belfin after Belfin Ludovic destroyed, and barrier after barrier he penetrated until he reached the top. At the head of the stairs was a vast golden door. "Go no further, Ludovic Eversoul!" a mighty voice roared from within. "To open that door is to bring disaster upon your race." But all Ludovic knew was that he had to get to the Belfin within and warn him. He battered down the door. That is, he would have battered down the door if it had not turned out to be unlocked. A stream of noxious vapour rushed out of the opening, causing him to black out. When he came to, most of the vapour had dissipated. The Belfin of Belfins was already dying of asphyxiation, since it was, in fact, a single alien entity who breathed another combination of elements. The room at the head of the stairs had been its tank. "You fool," it gasped. "Through your muddle-headed integrity, you have destroyed not only me, but Earth's future. I tried to make this planet a better place for humanity, and this is my reward." "But I don't understand," Ludovic wept. "Why did you let me do it? Why were Mieczysław and George and all the others killed? Why was it that I could pass the barriers and they could not?" "The barriers were triggered to respond to hostility. You meant well, so our defenses could not work." Ludovic had to bend low to hear the creature's last words. "There is Earth proverb. Should have warned me. I can protect myself against my enemies, but who will protect me from my friends?" The Belfin of Belfins died in Ludovic's arms. He was the last of his race, so far as Earth was concerned, for no more came. If, as they had said themselves, some outside power had sent them to take care of the human race, then that power had given up the race as a bad job. If they were merely exploiting Earth, as the malcontents had kept suggesting, apparently it had proven too dangerous or too costly a venture. Shortly after the Belfin's demise, the Flockhearts arrived en masse. "We won't need your secret weapons now," Ludovic told them dully. "The Belfin of Belfins is dead." Coruscant gave one of the rippling laughs he was to grow to hate so much. "Darling, you were my secret weapon all along." She beamed at her relatives, and it was then he noticed the faint lines of her forehead. "I told you I could use the power of love to destroy the Belfins." And then she added gently, "I think there is no doubt who is head of this family now." The uncle gave a strained laugh. "You're going to have a great little first lady there, boy," he said to Ludovic. "First lady?" Ludovic repeated, still absorbed in his grief. "Yes, I imagine the people will want to make you our first president by popular acclaim." Ludovic looked at him through a haze of tears. "But I killed the Belfin. I didn't mean to, but they must hate me." "Nonsense, my boy. They'll adore you. You'll be a hero." Events proved him right. Even those people who had lived in apparent content under the Belfins, accepting what they were given and seemingly enjoying their carefree lives, now declared themselves to have been suffering in silent resentment all along. They hurled flowers and adulatory speeches at Ludovic and composed extremely flattering songs about him. Shortly after he was universally acclaimed president, he married Coruscant. He couldn't escape. "Why doesn't she become president herself?" he wailed when the relatives came and found him hiding in the ruins of the Blue Tower. The people had torn the tower down as soon as they were sure the Belfin was dead and the others thereby rendered inoperant. "It would spare her a lot of bother." "Because she is not the Belfin slayer," the uncle said, dragging him out. "Besides, she loves you. Come on, Ludovic, be a man. So they hauled him off to the wedding and, amid much feasting, he was married to Coruscant. He never drew another happy breath. In the first place, now that the Belfin was dead, all the machinery that had been operated by him stopped and no one knew how to fix it. The sidewalks stopped moving, the air conditioners stopped conditioning, the food synthesizers stopped synthesizing, and so on. And of course everybody blamed it all on Ludovic, even that year's run of bad weather. There were famines, riots, plagues, and after the waves of mob hostility had coalesced into national groupings, wars. It was like the old days again, precisely as described in the textbooks. In the second place, Ludovic could never forget that when Coruscant had sent him to the Blue Tower, she could not have been sure that her secret weapon would work. Love might not have conquered all. In fact, it was the more likely hypothesis that it wouldn't, and he would have been killed by the first barrier. And no husband likes to think that his wife thinks he's expendable. It makes him feel she doesn't really love him. So, in 30th year of his reign as dictator of Earth, Ludovic poisoned Coruscant, that is, had her poisoned, for by now he had a minister of assassination to handle such little matters, and married a very pretty, very young, very affectionate blonde. He wasn't particularly happy with her either, but at least it was a change. If you're enjoying the stories, make sure to hit the like button. It helps me create more stories and compilations by growing the channel. Thanks. Sales Resistance by Henry Still. Narrated by William Skye. When consumption means prosperity, when the Pulitzer Prize is awarded to advertising copy, when the salesman is the most respected citizen in the land, what chance has a non-consumer? On his way home from the concert, Perry Mansfield whistled a pleasant melody from an old Stravinsky classic. But then, troubled by his conscience and that of his psychiatrist, he stopped to study the program again. What was that modern symphony? Oh yes, the Flivver. The music was supposed to have its roots in antiquity, when someone started converting the metal wealth of the earth on an assembly line. Those screeching noises were drill presses and lathes and automatic hammers. The syrupy melody was the saintly salesman who dispersed the wealth of gadget and machine like melted butter across the bread of the land. Perry tried to like it, but he didn't, and that disturbed him. It meant his psychotherapy wasn't working. Dr. Stone would run him through the mechanical analyzer again and scold over the results. His simple act of walking home instead of riding an anti-gravity putter seat labelled him as a misfit. But it seemed silly to rent a flying stool just to travel 2 blocks. The fact was, he liked to walk. Perry sighed, discouraged, as he waited for the fluorescent scanner to identify his insides and open his front door. It opened. The lights came on. Recorded music, somewhat tuned to his mood, poured from concealed amplifiers. And then he noticed the note clipped to the door. His hand trembled as he took it down. The beautiful pastel grey of the enclosing envelope was an anachronism itself, and therefore marked unmistakably its almost priestly origin. The platinum-engraved card inside said simply, "A master salesman has chosen you for his next call." Perry placed the note carefully on a plastic table. He inhaled deeply and held it for a moment to steady his nerves. A master salesman. No one of that stature had ever called upon him before. It was an honor, like a mayor or a bishop. It meant he had attained top level on the universal measuring stick, an A number 1++ credit rating. The prospect should have saturated him with pleasure, but like the sharp new music, it didn't. This card also meant he was expected to buy something Something big and expensive. And he didn't want or need something big and expensive. He wished they'd leave him alone. Perry clapped his hand to his mouth as though someone might have heard the thought. What was wrong with him anyway? He wasn't a recluse. He wanted to indulge and enjoy the polished luxury of his world. He wanted to be conventional. He was young and handsome and tall and dark. He had a good job. He had a pleasant and comfortable legal arrangement with a girl in the next block. But truly, what he had was all he wanted. He glanced at the card on the table. He could always say no. It wouldn't be easy, but he could say no. Perry thumbed through the Pulitzer Prize-winning work for 2087 which had been delivered yesterday as part of his book club subscription. He had already seen it, of course, in a dozen magazines and 100 copies of his facsimile newspaper. It was the advertising copy for Courtesan Foundation garments. But he didn't need a corset, and the Spartan simplicity of the fragile, lovely words bored him. He switched on television. A frenetic band was hammering out the new top jingle on the hit parade. Tootsie gum, ooh yum yum, it's touched with rum. Love that girl with eyes so hot, tootsie gum hits the spot. Perry switched off the set. He was alone. He could be honest with himself. The whole damned business irritated him. If he was out of step with the times, to hell with the times. Mr. Master Salesman didn't even say when he would call. You were expected to sit on the edge of your chair waiting for the great man to appear. Finally, Perry decided what he'd do. He'd simply not open the door when the MS came knocking. Upon that decision, he slept well. Some time later, he dreamed of frying bacon over an open fire in the woods, although he hadn't been out to the park in 3 years. When he opened his eyes, the sun was up. He still smelled bacon frying. Perry crawled out of bed, fumbled into his robe, and followed his nose to the kitchen bar. There, in his favourite chair, sat a handsomely dressed, distinguished man with florid complexion, iron grey hair, and a fashionable paunch. Strips of bacon were frying on the bright, spotless steel of the cooking shield. "How did you get in here?" Perry asked crossly. "Serve all does all," his visitor said cryptically, and smiled the smile that's known around the world. Perry would have no opportunity to shut out the master salesman. He was in. "You are Mr. Mansfield?" "Yes, sir," Perry said, uncertain of decorum. "My name is Marlborough," the MS said in melodious tones. "Master is the proper term used in addressing us. Please sit down." "Yes, master," Perry said. He felt like a fool and sat down. "Breakfast will be served in a few moments," Marlborough said. "I hope you don't mind. I examined your excellent library before you came in." He pulled a volume off the shelf. "This is a beautiful old first edition. Wherever did you find it?" It was Perry's copy of Basic Sales Techniques, with Burton footnotes on vacuum cleaner sales charts for the last half of the 20th century. "I've read it, of course," Marlborough continued, "but I've never owned a copy." He caressed the dog-eared cardboard cover. "Isn't it fantastic? In that barbaric century, the customers sometimes refused to buy from our predecessors in the guild. It seems impossible that anyone could have been so crude as to turn away one of those sturdy pioneers at the door." Perry shifted uncomfortably. He had been prepared to turn away one of the great men at his door. "Ah," Marlborough exclaimed. "Your bacon is ready, young man." At a flick of the salesman's finger, the golden strips of meat lifted into the air and floated to an absorbent mat on the table. Perry stared. Not a bubble of fat had fallen to the floor in passage. "How did you do that?" "Serve all does all," the MS said coyly. "Mine doesn't," Perry said. "Of course not." Marlborough moved deftly into the opening. "You need a new one." So he had tumbled for the first trap. Perry blushed and ate a piece of bacon. The master hefted an object to the tabletop. It was a hemisphere about 18 inches in diameter, smooth and featureless except for a handle on the curved top. It was painted psychological green. "This is the new serval," Marlborough said glibly. "Notice its smooth, unobtrusive shape. No working parts exposed, but inside is a mass of circuits and servos around a baby reactor ready to do everything for you." "The bacon," Perry persisted. "How?" He was aware that the first step in successful selling is to arouse curiosity. But he was confident he could refuse to buy, though it be contrary to convention and good taste. "Fingers of energy," the MS said. "Invisible, sensitive fingers of energy reach out of here," he tapped the serval dome, "and they'll do anything that needs doing at your mental command. Right now, this one's tuned to me, but a minor adjustment will fit it to your personal needs. Here, let me show you something else." Perry felt a gentle, firm pressure on his left cheekbone. It moved down his cheeks, across his upper lip, and up the other side. Then under his chin. Marlborough whipped out a pocket mirror. Perry had just been shaved. "See?" the master beamed. "Wonderful, isn't it?" Perry nodded. That was calculated to put him in a yes mood. While they talked, the serval cleared the breakfast clutter and cleaned the cooking shield without visible remains or waste. Marlborough pulled a contract pad out of his pocket. "I presume I can put you down for one of these?" "I don't need it," Perry said. "My old one is good enough." "Ridiculous," Marlborough said indignantly, and then chuckled good-humouredly. "Oh, I see what you're doing. You're trying some of the old tricks from the 20th century. Well, I like a game of wits too. Look what else this model will do." While Perry watched, the serval repaired a broken knob on a plastic chest, cleaned the rug, and etched a mural of a voluptuous nude on one blank wall. "If you'll excuse me," Perry murmured, "it's time for me to go to work." Of course, the master laughed jovially. In rapid succession, a comb dressed Perry's hair, his robe and pyjamas were whisked off, and his street clothes came floating out of the closet on more invisible fingers of energy. Before he knew it, he was ready for work. "I really must be going too," Marlborough said. "If you'll just sign here." "How much is it?" The master salesman sighed. "You're really very difficult. It's $9,785 plus tax." "I can't afford it." "Now, Mr. Mansfield, a joke's a joke. If your credit rating wasn't the finest, I wouldn't be here. I know and you know your income is mortgaged for only 15 more years and your life expectancy is at least 50. Perry moved uneasily toward the bathroom. An invisible finger of energy opened the door for him. "If you don't mind," he said angrily, "this is something I'm quite capable of doing for myself." He slammed the door. But the serval flushed the toilet for him. When he emerged, Marlborough's patience also was gone. "Sign," he said firmly. "I don't want it." "Young man," the master said thinly, "you don't realize what dangerous ground you're on. If you do not cease this rudeness at once, I'll report you to the council." "Report and be damned. I don't need your gadget, and I'm not going to buy it. Now get out." Marlborough was blue with rage. He backed uncertainly toward the door and stopped. "This borders on sacrilege," he whispered. "You'll hear from me again. Soon." Perry slammed that door too and walked jauntily to work. He heard from the master salesman again, exactly 2 hours later. The message tube delivered a summons ordering him into City Court that afternoon. Perry went. He had never been in court before. He was frightened and regretful that he had been so abrupt with Marlborough. But he resented the invasion of his privacy, and to bolster his courage, he built that anger into a fair rage by the time he reached the courtroom. Marlborough was there. A judge was there. And on each of 2 tables squatted a metal box with voice tubes. A bailiff guided him to his table and placed the voice tube in his hand. "You're late, Mr. Mansfield," the judge snapped. "Justice must be swift, and you're impeding it." He lifted a printed card and scanned it nearsightedly for a moment. "You're here charged with violating the public interest by failing to purchase an item which you are able to consume and which you can afford to buy." "There's no law against," Perry began indignantly. "Don't tell me your troubles, young man," the judge interrupted. "That's what your lawyer's for." His gesture indicated the metal box. Perry held the voice tube dumbly. The bailiff leaned over his shoulder. "You tell your side of the story in there," he whispered. Marlborough was muttering rapidly and at great length into his lawyer. Perry did likewise, relating all he could remember of the morning fiasco. When he finished, the machine whirred, whistled, and harumphed twice before spewing out several yards of perforated tape. The plaintiff's counsel did the same, except the tape was longer. "Now, Mr. Bailiff," the judge said, "you may bring in the jury." Perry was no longer surprised when the jury was rolled in. It was a large grey analog computer mounted on wheels. The judge stepped down from the bench and fed in the two conflicting tapes. The jury digested the information noisily. "It's an old model," the judge apologized, but just then a white card popped out on a small metal tray. The bailiff delivered it to the judge. He studied the card. Perry's heart thumped painfully during the calculated period of suspense. "As you attempted to inform the court earlier, Mr. Mansfield," the judge said somberly, "there is no law in the land which forces you to buy any item from our distinguished colleagues of distribution." Perry's heart brightened and he slid back from the edge of the chair. "However," the judge peered down, "it has been held by many courts that when the public interest is to be served by the individual purchase of a piece of merchandise which that individual can consume and which that individual is able to buy without financial hardship, then that individual must sacrifice his emotional reluctance to the good of society." The jurist paused thoughtfully. "I think, Mr. Mansfield, that you should relearn the basic tenets of our society and economy. First, consumption is prosperity, and that derives from the ancient law of supply and demand. S&D means, in simple terms, that when there is a supply of something, a demand must be created to consume it. That is why we have master salesmen. That is why they are the staunchest and most highly respected citizens in our land." He bowed to Marlborough, who assumed a benevolent smile. "This court decrees," the judge said sternly, "that you are to purchase an item known as the 2087 Serval from Master Salesman Marlborough, and customary steps will be taken to attach your future salary to satisfy the stipulated payment schedule. Court dismissed." Perry was too stunned to move. His petty rebellion had collapsed into a pot of embarrassment. He was vaguely aware of Marlborough shaking his hand with a moist, jovial palm. "No hard feelings, young man," the MS said. "It was really quite interesting. I haven't had a case like this in 5 years. The condescension stirred Perry's anger again. "I demand an appeal." The judge was leaving the bench, but he turned back. "Appeal bond is $2,000. "No appeal," Perry said glumly. He walked home. The 2087 Serval was there waiting for him in the middle of his living room floor. Marlborough had tied a gay red ribbon around it to cheer him. He wasn't cheered. The thing must have been delivered even while he was in court. There had never been a doubt that he would lose the case. Rage began to crawl its acid path through his stomach again. The Serval was tuned to him now. It removed his hat and coat and put them in the closet. It loosened his tie, patted a sofa cushion to his shape, and brought him a drink. Perry might just possibly have adjusted to the situation, but the Serval was over-anxious. He liked to sip a drink, but when he lifted the glass to his lips, an invisible finger of energy pushed helpfully on the bottom. Perry strangled. When he recovered, his rage had crystallized in a definite course of action. He looked at the serval, and he looked at his hands. Not enough. He needed something much more. His memory of history recalled such items as an axe and a sledgehammer, but such no longer existed. But the plastic table had legs of substantial heft. A low growl rose in his throat as he grabbed the table and ripped it to pieces. The dismayed serval scuttled across the room to repair the damage. Perry fended it off with his new club, and then smashed downward, again and again, delighting in the screech of crushed metal and the tinkling death of transistors, vacuum tubes, and servos. At the centre was the tiny reactor box, but that was of solid lead and steel that, fortunately, was virtually impervious for radiation safety. But he didn't care. It was also inert and needn't be destroyed. So Perry was free. As free as an aging husband who has just dispatched his jaded wife. He sang a little and danced around the shattered scraps of plastic and wire and metal. Then he heard the plaintive bleating beep of sound issuing from the central core of the serval. He bent over it and read engraved lettering on the steel. Central Registry number C187D69. Good God! Any idiot would know that every piece of equipment was centrally registered and carried a built-in signal to summon repair machinery. And the destruction of mortgaged property was a criminal offence. So what now? Escape? Escape. He must be out of the house when the repair machine arrived. He must run and keep running from the law and the master salesman and Serval Incorporated. How much time did he have? Not more than a few minutes for the smooth central machinery to reach across the city to him, machinery which even now was on its way to rescue a damaged brother. Perry snatched his coat from the closet and ran to the door. Food. If he would hide from the methodical meat grinder of society, he must have food to live. He raced to the kitchen bar. There was food there, but he didn't know how to get at it. He had never before needed to do more than dial up portions for a meal, but he must have food in containers, food that would not spoil while he conserved his life on its dwindling supply. He ripped open a locked panel on the wall. There was food, but the large containers were locked in place. He clawed at the metal, but only tore his flesh and dripped blood on the immaculate countertop. The club he had used on the serval. He recovered the plastic bludgeon and went to work. 5 minutes later, he had dislodged 2 of the large tins. One said beans, the other said meat. Beans dripped a trail of juice across the floor as he ran to the door. He threw it open. A repair robot scuttled in and knocked him sprawling on the living room floor. Perry stared wildly at the mechanical beast. It hummed anxiously, retrieving bits of wreckage like a mother bird repairing a broken egg. Mansfield belly crawled stealthily back toward the door. He might make it yet. The robot probably wasn't geared for cop duty. But the door was blocked. Perry looked up past the knees and the belted paunch to the face. It was Master Marlborough. Perry rose wearily to his feet and dropped the tins of food to the floor. "All right," he said. "I give up." "Really, Mr. Mansfield?" Marlborough's lips curled with delicate disgust. "Isn't this a childish way to treat a beautiful machine?" "What will you do with me?" The MS didn't answer. He pulled a contract pad out of his pocket and started writing. "You mean you're going to sell me another one?" Marlborough shoved the pad in his hand. "I'm quite sure you'll sign this one," he said firmly. Perry read the sales contract. "For standard consideration, this entitles one Perry Mansfield to all required services and exclusive use of private quarters in Airy Hill Sanitarium." Perry signed. Perchance to Dream by Richard Stockham. Narrated by William Skye. If you wish to escape, if you would go to faraway places, then go to sleep and dream, for sometimes that is the only way. All along the line of machines, the men's hands and arms worked like the legs of spiders spinning a web. They wound wire and hammered bolts, tied knots and welded pieces of steel and fitted gears. They did not look at each other, or sing, or whistle, or talk, or laugh. And then he made a mistake. Instantly, he stepped back and a troubleshooter moved into his place. The troubleshooter's hands flew over the controls. The troubleshooter finished, and the workman took his place. His arms moved ceaselessly again. He was a tall man, slim and wiry, his dress identical to that of the others, grey coveralls that fit like tights. Suddenly, a red light flashed in his eyes and he began to tremble. He took 2 steps backward. The troubleshooter moved into the empty space. The man stood for a moment like a soldier at attention, turned and walked smartly toward the mouth of a corridor. The silence was like a motion picture with a dead soundtrack. There was only motion, and him walking down the line of machines where the hands reached out, working. In the corridor now, he looked straight ahead, marching. The walls glowed like water beneath a shallow sea. He raised his arm, felt the door strike and the heel of his hand, felt it swing open, saw the desk suspended from the ceiling by luminous silver chains. A man with a massive white-maned head and a pink smiling face rose from behind the desk. His suit was like that of a general. "Well, 23. The superfather stared down at the dossier on his desk. 2 mistakes in 3 months. Too bad. Just when you were on your way to the head of the machine room." "I don't know what's the matter with me," said 23. "I'm afraid we'll have to drop you back to a less responsible position." "Of course." The superfather looked up quickly. "You accept this? No depression? No threat of suicide? You are in bad shape." He handed a packet of cards to 23. "Put these in your dream machine tonight. Go to your new job tomorrow." 23 stood motionless, staring over the other man's shoulder. The superfather sat down. "Tell me about the dreams you have when you don't use the machine." 23 made a quick decision. He couldn't tell him he didn't use the standard dream cards anymore, and he certainly couldn't tell about the other dream cards he'd been getting from the little man he'd met on the street. He'd simply answer the factual truth to the question that had been asked. "Well," he said, as though he were confessing a crime, "I dream I'm walking in the city. It's dark. I feel like I've got to find something. I don't know what, but the feeling's very strong. All of a sudden I notice the city's empty. There are just buildings and streets and a faint glow of light. And it comes to me that everybody's dead and buried. Then I know what I'm looking for. I've got to find something alive or I'll die too. So I start running around, in and out buildings, up and down streets. But there's nothing. I'm breathing so hard I think my heart's going to burst. Finally, I fall down. I feel myself beginning to die. I try to get up, but I can't. I try to yell. I've got no voice. I'm so afraid I can't stand it. Then I wake up." The superfather frowned. "Incredible. Several other cases like yours have turned up in the last month. We're working on them, but yours is the worst yet. You had such high capabilities. Your tests showed, when you first began to work 10 years ago, that you were capable of going to the head of your production line. But you're not doing it. Also, your normal dreams should correspond to the ones on the cards. And they don't. Are you using the standard cards every other night? 23 lied. Yes. And the nights you don't use them, you have a dream like the one you just told me? That's right. Incredible. The Superfather shook his head. It just doesn't add up. As you know, you get the prescribed dreams every other night, and that's supposed to condition your mind to dreaming those same dreams by itself on the nights you don't use the machine. The prescribed dreams merely show you the true way of life, and when you're on your own, you're supposed to follow that way of life whether you're asleep or awake. That's what the dream machine is for. I'm sure you're aware of all this. Yes, said 23. Yes. Now, we superfathers never have to use the dream machines. We're so filled with the way of life they advocate, and it's become such an integral part of us, we simply are what our prescribed dreams are. And the more successful a person is in the city, the less he has to use the dream machine. Now you have to use it every other night. That's entirely too much for a man of your potential. You realize this, of course. Oh, I do, said 23, shaking his head sadly. Well now, said the Superfather, that means something's wrong. Very wrong. He rubbed his chin, thinking. Your prescribed dreams show you working faster and faster on the machines, going on month after month, year after year, with 100% accuracy. They show you happy in your work, driven by ambition on up to the end of your capabilities. They show you contented there to the end of your working life. He paused. And you're doing just the opposite. I suppose your wife is concerned. 23 nodded. After all, the marriage center assured her your index was right for her. Her sleep cards were coordinated with yours. The normal dreams of both of you without the machine should be identical. Yet you come up with this horror running through the city alone, falling, dying. 23's mouth twitched. Well, the Superfather stood. If you can't adjust to normal, we'll simply have to send you to the prefrontal lobotomy men. You wouldn't want that. Oh, no. Good. The Superfather held out another packet of cards. Use these tomorrow night. It's a concentration pattern which should be dense enough to make you dream of being, well, perhaps even president, eh? Yes, 23 hesitated. Well, said the Superfather. I'd like to ask a question. The Superfather nodded. What use, went on 23, is all this work being put to that we do along the machine lines every day? We don't seem to really be making anything, just working. The Superfather's eyes narrowed. You're kept busy. You get paid. You live. The city is here. That's all. That's enough. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. 23 turned abruptly, marched to the door, and stepped into the empty, silent corridor. 23 looked up at the glowing dome of the city that curved away to the horizon. He wondered if there really was a white ball beyond it sometimes, and tiny dots of light set in blue-black. And at other times did a ball of fire flame up there, giving light and heat and life. And if there was this life and light up there, why the great dome over the city? Why the factories and machine lines replacing it section after section, generation after generation? The slabs that the workers fused together this year and the next, pushing back this life and light and heat. Why not let it pour down into the city and warm all the people? Why not go to the space out there and the depth and freedom? Why this great shell that closed them away? For the sake of the Superfathers, maybe? And the Superfathers Plus? For the sake of the ones like himself, maybe, who worked and built? For the sake of them so they wouldn't become dangerous, maybe, and tear the Great Wall down and rush out into whatever was beyond? Why else? But it could be all a farce. They could all be working in the Great Dome because they didn't know what was beyond. Who could know if they'd never been beyond? And so they were held under the domes with the buildings and the machines that carried them all around in the city, held with the plumbing and the theatres and all the intricate mechanisms that spoke to them and fed them, that washed them and poured thoughts into their minds, that healed them when they were sick and rested them when they were tired. The same as they were held with the Great Dome, held and shackled with the replacing of parts that didn't need replacing, the making over and over again of the tiny and large pieces of the mechanisms, and the taking of the old mechanisms and the melting of them or smashing of them to powder, so that this dust or molten metal could be fashioned again and again into the same pieces that they had been for so many thousands of years. All this to keep them busy? All this to keep something outside that was supposed to be destructive because once it had been so 5,000 years ago, or 10, or 50? All this because that was the way it had been for as long as the hundreds and the thousands of years that history had been recorded? He walked on through the silence, dimly aware now of the people moving about him, of the automobiles rolling past as though moved by some invisible force. He passed row upon row of movie theatres that called to him with invisible vibrations. He turned away. Where was the little man? He stopped, moving only his eyes. After a moment, he saw the little man step out of a shop front and stand waiting. 23, a cigarette in his mouth, walked over and asked for a light. The little man touched a lighter to the cigarette, at the same time dropping a packet of cards into 23's pocket. 23 moved on. He felt the pounding of his heart. If only his wife were asleep so he would not have to wait to look at these new cards. As he walked, his thoughts cried out against the silence. He glanced suspiciously from side to side. If only he could hear the sounds of the city. But except for human voices and music, the city had always been silent. The human voices spoke only words written by the superfathers, and the music came from records that had been composed by them, all this back when the city had first come into being. Other than these sounds, there could be only the quiet all around. No chugging motors or scraping footsteps. No crashing engines in the sky or pounding of steel on stone. No shrieking of factory whistles or clanging steeple bells or honking automobile horns. None of this to pluck and pound at nerves, to suggest that this place was not the most soothing and gentle of all places to be in. There were no winds to swirl and moan away into the distance. The chirp of birds had long since been stilled, and so had the patter of rain and the crash of thunder. There must not be any of these sounds either to lure the imagination into some distance where danger and excitement might be waiting. Now he was walking toward the door of his apartment house. It swung open. 30 seconds later, he stopped before another door. It too swung open. His wife stood in the middle of the room between two travelling bags. He moved slowly toward her and stopped just out of arm's reach. "What's this?" He gestured toward the bags. "Where are you going?" She stared at him for a long moment, her face set. She was of his height and build, and wore a suit the same light grey as his. Their haircuts were identical, their faces sharp-featured and pale. They might have been brother and sister, or two brothers or two sisters. "I'm going to the marriage centre." "What for?" He had tried to inject surprise into his voice, but the tone was listless. "The superfather called about your dream." 23 turned away, lighted a cigarette. He should beg her to stay, should promise to change. But the silence was in him like a sickness. "A terrible thing's happening to you. I don't want any part of it." She picked up the bags. "When you come to your senses, you know where to reach me. If I haven't already made another contract, I might come back to you." She hesitated at the door. "There's one thing I don't understand. You haven't begged me to stay. You haven't broken down. You haven't threatened suicide." She paused. "It's standard procedure, you know. It might even make me decide to wait a while." "I don't want you to stay," he said. He felt a shock of surprise. It was as though a voice had spoken from behind him. He watched the door shut between them. Dressed in his pajamas, he stood beside the metal tube in which for so many years he had slept his regulation sleep and dreamed his regulation dreams. There was something of the finely made casket about this tube, the 6-foot length and 3-foot diameter, the lid along its top, and the dull shine of the metal, and the quiet of it, as though it were asleep and lying in wait for a tired body to bring it awake so that it could put the body to sleep and live in the dreams it would give to the sleeper. Beside his own tube stood its twin, where his wife had also slept and dreamed through the years. Leaning slightly forward, he felt the press of metal against his hip bones, felt the tube roll an inch with his weight. He rested one hand on the metal top, felt its warmth and smoothness, was aware of its cleanness, like that of a surgical instrument. Now he glanced at the glistening black panel that stood 2 feet high at the tube's head, quickly checked its 4 illuminated dials and 3 gleaming arrows, and at the same time raised his hand to drop the cards into the softly glowing slot at the panel's top. Suddenly his hand stopped. He bent forward. What was this? A feeling of strangeness. Vague. Like sensing some subtle change in a picture that has hung for 20 years above the fireplace in one's home. He drew closer, squinting. The dials and meters seemed to be the same as they had yesterday and the day before and the year before. And yet, the dials. Larger, by a fraction? And the tiny gleaming arrows of the meters. Barely longer? And the marks on the dials and meters. 1 extra each, very faintly, like a piece of hair. He was very still for a long moment. Then he moved around the foot of his own sleeping tube, pushed between the two, and stood at the head of the other one. He checked its dials and meters. They were as they had been for many years. He stepped back to the panel of his own and pressed a button. As the glistening metal top rose silently, he ran his hand around the yawning interior, felt the downy softness and the body-like warmth. Then his hand touched a pliable metal plate. That should not be there. He stood back, remembering the workman who had come into the house that morning for the routine check-up of the tubes. His wife had already left for work, and he had just stepped through the door when they had met him in the corridor. They had gone on into the rooms, and he had sensed vaguely that something was wrong. Then he had put the feeling out of his mind and gone to his work. Now suddenly he turned to the illuminated 4-inch square panel above the door, read April 15th, 2563. The workman had checked a day early. He frowned. Either the superfather had ordered the machine changed, which was highly improbable because every object in the city was standardized and any change would upset the established order, or the workmen were tied up with the man who had given him the different dream cards. In any event, he had to sleep in the tube that night, and he definitely wanted to dream the dreams on the cards he had just gotten from the man on the corner. He dropped the cards into the slot at the top of the panel, climbed into the tube, and pressed a button. The top closed over him like a hand. He lay still, feeling the warm clasp wash over his body. There was darkness and silence and a cool motion of antiseptic air. He could try the first dream. If it wasn't right, he could shut it off and sleep without dreams. He pressed another button. Silence. The sound of his regular breathing. Then a sighing came into his mind, and a green haze. The sighing became a soft breeze, the green, tree-covered hills rolling off to the horizon. He relaxed, aware in a fading, sinking part of his consciousness that the machine worked as usual. He would dream and wait and hope. And so the wind was breathing across the land from off a vast stretch of blue water, which broke along a sandy beach in foamy white breakers. The surf thundered all through his body. The wind brushed against him like a great purring cat. He looked up at the blue sky and seemed to feel himself rising and sinking, both at the same time, up into its depths. As his sight touched the sun, there was an explosion of brightness which blinded him. He turned away then to the rolling green sea of hills, saw the trees bending from the surge of wind, and heard the rustling of leaves. And then a deep voice moved through his mind. "Outside the city," it said, "all this exists. During the terrible burning of the earth back in the wars of its antiquity, the city was built as a place of life for those who yet lived. But those people were not aware that the earth would come alive again, and they made the city so that no death could enter it from without, and no life could escape from within. And they turned away from the earth, and lived only with the city, so that it became their universe, to all but a very few of us. We still held a faint awareness of what the earth had been. This passed down to us for many generations in whisperings by the wise ones of our people back in the beginning of the city. And in those times we had been in the city too long, for thousands of years. We knew that there must be freedom beyond the walls, if we could get through. But the walls were thick and high and without a floor, making a sky over us. We worked for 500 years on a machine to get us through the wall. Now, a few of us have succeeded, and more will follow us to the freedom out here in the good land. There is room for everyone here. There are no boundaries and no ceilings and no walls anywhere. And you may join us sometime in the near future, if you wish." 23 sighed in his sleep. Now a great city faded into his mind. There were long, tree-lined streets and buildings, some built in rising spirals, some in spreading squares, others in ovals, domes, and curved half-circles. The wind wandered among the buildings and the bursts of green. People dressed in white flowing robes or black tights walked the streets. He could hear their footsteps on the stone or grassy walk, could hear the hum of vehicles rolling along the streets or flying through the air. They were long and streamlined or short and round, or they were curved like gondolas or squat like saucers. And they were moving at many speeds. Yet there was order, and the air was sweet and clean. A black line of clouds was rising across the horizon. Soon there would be lightning and thunder and cool rain. The deep voice touched him again. "This is the city that can be. A city of life, open to the sky and the earth, a city in which people can find and follow their own lives. After the wars, the cities were built to shut out the death of Earth. But the Earth has come to life again, and so can the cities." The silence came while the picture changed and 23 stirred, waiting. A figure grew in his mind, wavered, and became a woman. 23 saw the long body and the softness, saw the flowing hair and the smile as she watched him. He saw the gentleness in her face, saw a strength under the softness, like the storm that lies below the charged quiet of a summer evening. Her lips moved. "Paul, dream your dreams for us." The words seemed to fall on him. He trembled and cried out, and he felt a violent stirring in his body and a breaking away as though he had flung himself through the walls of a tomb. The picture blew away while the voice continued. "She is a woman, not a woman who half resembles a man." A pause. "When you wish to leave the city, ask for the final card. You are welcome." There was silence and darkness. 23 stirred. He opened his eyes. The glow from the city outside filtered into the room through the translucent walls. He lay motionless. Paul. He was Paul, not 23. A man with a name. Wonder came into him, and a sense of strength, and a willingness to remember without fear. His mind ran back to the first mistake almost a year past. He remembered the horror of failure then, and the terror at his being subjected to a mistake. He remembered the inference from the Superfather that there might be a bad strain in his bloodline. He remembered taking the dream cards that were to have set him straight, that were to have shown him working over the machines with super speed, moving up along the production line to its pinnacle, and on up to the position of Superfather, and on up to Superfather Plus, and on up to the place of Father of the City. But the cards had been sabotaged, so that from them into his mind had come the dreams of the trees and the oceans and the green earth spreading off to the horizon and the expanse of blue sky. And then the words had directed him to the little man who had given him the cards on the street corner. They had known him, the words had said, through what was called telepathic screening, for ones suitable to leave the city. He was one of those chosen because he, like a few others, had been unable to adjust completely to the demands of the city. He was one of those in whom a rebellious nature had been passed down from generation to generation, by attitudes and acts of his ancestors, by a word spoken here and one there, by an intangible reaching out toward the sky and the green growing things and the need to understand who and what he was. But in him now this feeling was weak and close to death, and would die in him if it were not brought out into life of the earth. Now the memories receded. He lay motionless, listening to his breathing and his heartbeat, feeling his body press against the softness that held him. Suddenly a shaft of light fell on him through the transparent square. Opening his eyes, he saw his wife's face staring down at him. She moved her hand. The lid of the tube raised. He lay watching her, feeling naked and, for a moment, helpless. "I talked for a long while with your Superfather," she said. "I feel better. He told me you'd promised to take the prescribed dreams tonight." 23 turned his face away from her. She began to undress. "I'm going out for a walk." He stepped from the machine. She watched him dress, her look a mixture of curiosity and fright. When he left, it was though he were leaving an empty room, and she watched him as though he were not quite human. The glow of the city was all around him as he walked toward the corner where the little man stood. The telepathic advertisers reached out from the places of entertainment, pulling at him. The voices enveloped him for a moment so that he almost turned back to them. But then he saw in his mind his arms working over the machines, saw them make a wrong motion that smashed a gear, saw the flashing red light and the heavy, expressionless face of the Superfather. He was aware that his memory would be erased, and the skies, and the ocean, and the green hills. His name would be gone. Paul would die, and the city would be his tomb. Quickly, he turned down a side street, saw the small figure leaning against the corner of the building. Walking rapidly toward him as though he were being chased, he saw the lean, ruddy face smile and the deep blue eyes look at him, heard the voice gently say, "Welcome, Paul." "The last card," said 23. The little man handed it to him quickly. "Good luck. Turn the dials 1 extra point on the control panel. Our men have made the machine ready. It's time now." 23 thrust the card into the inner pocket of his jacket. So that was it. They had changed the machine. 1 extra point, he repeated, glancing up and down the street. "And remember," said the little man, "destroy all the cards you've used before. They were designed particularly for you. If you don't make it across to us, the Superfathers will use the cards against you." 23 whirled around. The little man had gone. 23 suddenly felt weak. My God, the other cards! Left in the machine. If his wife... He stood very still for a long moment, then he ran. The door to his apartment swung open. The room beyond was empty. A light shone faintly. He stood for a moment, listening. Silence. He stepped to the bedroom. The top of his wife's sleeping tube was closed. He could see her face through the transparent square, could hear her quiet breathing. In one quick, silent motion, he stepped to the side of his own tube, pulling the last card from his pocket and dropped it into the glowing slot at the top of the black control panel. Then he turned the dials to the extra point. Several minutes later, he pressed the button at the bottom of the control panel. The top opened. At the same moment, he heard a step behind him. He whirled around. The Superfather stood in the doorway. At his back hovered the dark bulks of two other men. 23 felt his muscles lock. He saw the Superfather's dead smile, and then his wife stepping down to the floor and hurrying to the side of the Superfather. "Those pictures," she said, shuddering. "They were so strange." The Superfather held his eyes on 23, but spoke to the woman. "Thank God you were strong. It was commendable of you to call us." "I don't know what made me look at his dreams," she cried. "Maybe it was when I asked him if he'd taken the prescribed dreams and he didn't answer. Anyway, I tested his machine. It was insane." "Dreams made by some twisted mind," the Superfather said. "Remember, they've no real existence. Nothing lives or moves outside the city. There were old myths, but they've been dead for countless generations." He paused. "Where are the pictures?"
"I burned them."
"Good." He motioned to the men behind him. They came forward and stood on each side of 23. 23, said the Superfather. "We may have to erase your memories and your present individuality." He cleared his throat. "Our records show that some 2,000 people have disappeared in the last 5 years. Your case has much to do with it. Where do you get the new cards?" 23 was silent. The Superfather pulled out a pack of cards. "Before we leave this room, you'll be a different man. If you tell us," he waggled the cards in his right hand, "this'll be your new life. You'll have dreams of outdoing every man on the machine lines and fix your body so you'll have the capacity to do it. You will do it. You'll become a Superfather. You'll burn to excel them. You'll push on up, become a Superfather Plus. You'll work with ideas, ways of increasing efficiency, pushing the workmen faster and faster. And you'll find ways of conditioning them to meet the greater and greater demands for speed. The city and people will be at your fingertips. There'll be rooms of marble and gold for you, soft carpets and buttons to push that'll give you any desire instantly. You'll have everything and be everything." He paused and took a deep breath. "All this'll be yours if you'll tell us where you got the cards, without forcing us to probe your mind with the electric scalpel."
With an effort, 23 raised his eyes to the Superfather's face. "And if I don't tell you?"
"Moving a lever back and forth, twice a minute, hour after hour, year after year. Living in a bare cubicle. No entertainment, no desires." He paused. "And no memories."
23 looked over the Superfather's shoulder. The last card, he thought, is in the machine. Escape from the city. They said that from outside. I've got to know. No matter what they put in the machine, that card will show first. Even if it's only for 10 seconds or 30 or 60 or however long, I'll know. "No," he said. "I won't tell you." The woman gasped and hid her face. The Superfather, scowling, made a motion. The two dark men took hold of 23. They lifted him into the tube. The Superfather dropped the second pack of cards into the panel and pressed the button. The top closed silently, like a mouth. 23's eyes closed. His body waited. For an instant, blackness and silence, like a moment after death or a moment before birth. Then twilight or dusk over an ocean. A sky of pale blue. A shine on the gently surging waters. A scent of clean air, sea spray, the cool sound of wind. Then a man's voice, deep and flowing. You know that there is no entrance or exit to this city. It is sealed off and will always be so. But the dream machine in which you lie has been changed by our agents inside the city. The last card you dropped into it is different from the others. These changes have been made so your dream will become a reality. Your mind will be transmitted to us here among the hills and under the trees and by the ocean. And a new body, that we have grown artificially from all the elements, a body like the one you will leave behind, will be waiting for you. You need not be afraid. 23 felt himself moving forward. Sight and hearing and sensation without a body. Time dropping away like a forgetting of yesterday and tomorrow. There was only this moment. And then he felt the great humming, surging power of the machine, like an ocean rushing him toward some unseen shore. He was caught in a gigantic, tingling shockwave, and felt like a tremendously outsized torch, lit and flaming and carried, still burning, in the green tide of sizzling electricity. The machine screamed. The machine chanted. The machine raved. Dimly, he heard his wife cry, and above him felt the superfather scrabbling at the machine, the guards shouting. The machine shrieked, and the great tidal wave of power jolted and flung him, white-hot kindling, through air, through sky, up and down. Down upon a white shore, upon creaming sands, leaving him to quiet, to silence, to a pulling away of the tide. Now the scent of sea came strong into him. He heard the crash and roar of surf, and the rustling of leaves and the sweep of wind. There were bird songs and the cries of animals. He saw the spread of rolling hills, saw a stream searching its way among great rocks and swelling and rolling full into a river, and the river flowing and sinking into the sea. He felt the earth upon his feet and the touch of grass. Breezes heavy with green from the land eddied all around him and filled his body and washed him. He heard his name, saw people coming toward him saying, "Welcome." He felt their arms embracing him. He saw an open city growing among the hills. Its buildings rolled away with the hills of the earth and became a part of the earth. The people took him by the hand and led him toward it, speaking to him of no one hurting the other, and no one locked in a cell, and all the walls of this world outside tumbled down. He was happy, and repeated the name they spoke to him. Paul. Back in the city, in the room, the wife cried out. The superfather, too, seeing the strange look on the face of the man inside the chrysalis of the dream maker, quickly touched the button that raised the lid. He bent down and took the wrist of the cold man lying there. Dead. Are you sure? The superfather bent still further down and listened to the chest, and the wife came close, and they both stood there, half bent. The mouth of the dead man was open, and the superfather listened for any faint whisper of breath. The wife listened. They both looked at each other for a long time. Because, from the open mouth of the cold man lying there, faintly, far away and fading slowly into silence, they heard quiet laughter and the sound of many birds and voices and trees rustling in the late afternoon. Then it was gone, and no matter how the two people bending there waited and listened, it was like putting their ear to a white stone.
Remember to hit the like button if you're enjoying the video. Thanks. Shatter the Wall by Sydney Van Scyoc. Narrated by William Skye. They were a charming family, and everybody loved them to death, especially Amanda. There he stood, Bass McDowell, life-size on the wall. She made herself look at the hateful, broad-shouldered image with the deliberately penetrating black eyes. She made herself watch his boy image bend over Kippy's slender girl image, made herself listen to his mellow voice gasp, "Kippy, sweetie bug." Savagely, she thrust upward on the ebony lever. Bass McDowell, wall idol, and Kippy lurched and disappeared. Lights glowed from fixtures recessed into the ceiling, illuminating the long, windowless wall room. Catherine, whose hair was a snug, dark Kippy cap, leaped from the wall seat. "Don't turn it off now! Couldn't you even tell, Mother? He's going to kiss her! Turn it back on this minute!" Amanda stationed herself before the lever, shaking her head. "Not until I've spoken to you," she said. "Catherine, I don't think you realize yet what it means, but you're the youngest person, the very youngest, living in this city." "Quit calling me that. Everyone has to call me Kippy." She cocked her dark head, Kippy-like. The red mark caused by the constant prodding of her index finger against her cheek glared. "Bass loves Kippy. He called her Sweetie Bug." "I refuse to call you Kippy." She folded her arms. "I don't want to discuss your name again, Catherine." "It will be Kippy." She squirmed into a Kippy-like position. "Soon as I'm 21, I'll change it. You wait." "Perhaps you will, Catherine, but I'll never call you Kippy." "Oh, quit being silly and turn it on. He might kiss her again." She focused her blue eyes upon the wall. "Turn it on." "Catherine, I want to talk to you, and I intend to do so without Bass McDowell staring over my shoulder." She sat down beside her daughter. "Now, Catherine, you're 19 years old, and you're certainly attractive by any—" "I don't have dimples like Kippy does." Remembering, she poked her finger back into her cheek. "I'm not talking about Kippy." She stared at the finger sunk into her daughter's cheek, wondering how many times she had explained that it wouldn't cause a dimple. "I want you to get married, Catherine." "I've told you 1,000,000 times I won't. You're always after me," she wailed. "Bass won't ever marry anyone, not even Kippy, and she's got dimples. Bass says Bass McDowell is not a real person. He's only an actor. He's the realest thing in the world. But he won't marry me, so you'd better forget it." She stepped to turn the wall on again. Instantly, the ashtray was in Amanda's hand, the massive glass tray Dell had given her. She hurled it at the wall, which shattered with a brittle explosive splintering. Catherine jumped back, wailing. "I hate you!" Frantically, she manipulated the lever and twisted the ebony dials. "Bass, come back! Bass!" Amanda patted the wall seat. "Sit down, Catherine." Finally, the girl sat down, sullenly rubbing her eyes with her fists. "Catherine, have you noticed that we never see infants on the wall? We never see small children either, because, Catherine, you're the youngest person in this city. The week after you were born, the city hospital's obstetrical ward closed permanently." Catherine sobbed convulsively. "Who needs babies? I want Bass. The human race needs babies. Catherine, you sit so complacently in front of your wall and pretend there isn't a world. There won't be unless you wake up." "Don't be silly." "I'm not. Catherine, you may be the youngest person in the world for all I know. 40 or 50 years from now, this planet will be cluttered with blank walls. There'll be no one to watch them." "Well, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not different like you. Catherine, marry. Have children. Persuade your friends at the office." She laughed shrilly, rocking back against the wall seat. "Friends? They hate me, every one of them, and I hate them. Even if Bass did marry me, they'd only take him away." Amanda clutched her fists. "I don't want you to marry Bass. You must find some nice boy your own age." "Oh, Mother! You want me to marry some stupid, ugly boy? You can't make me!" "Catherine, he needn't be dull. There are hundreds of boys, each interesting in—" Hearing a sound, she looked up to see Dell, thin and red-headed, standing in the doorway staring at the shattered wall. Catherine jumped up. "Mother broke it. She threw that big green ashtray and broke it all to pieces.
Dell looked questioningly at Amanda.
Honey, why'd you do that? She's jealous of Bass. Now, isn't Bass pretty young for you, honey?
He stooped to remove the ashtray from inside the shattered wall.
Now how can I watch Alice this evening? She promised me a special dance in that red dress she was showing me last night. Showing you? She sprang up. She showed it to every man in the country, Dell.
He frowned.
Well, I'll call replacements. They'll have a new wall in before Alice comes. And I'll smash it too. I'll smash every replacement you can buy. Now, Amanda, he regarded her mildly, you're not jealous of Alice. Honey, if you'd watch Lester, you wouldn't care about Alice and me.
She took the intact ashtray from him.
I'm not jealous of Alice, and I haven't been for 20 years. But Dell, do you realise Catherine was the last child born in this city?
The girl's voice was harsh.
She wants me to marry some stupid, ugly boy, and I won't do it. I love Bass.
Dell's pale eyes were rebuking.
Amanda, how can you expect Kippy to do that?
She stepped back.
Kippy? She said harshly. Dell, that girl standing there is Catherine, our daughter, not Kippy. Don't let such little things upset you, baby. I'll go call replacements and we'll all sit down together when Alice and Lester come.
He turned. She seized his arm.
I will not watch Lester, she said. I will not sit and stare at that big grey-haired ape and pretend I'm in love with him.
Dell frowned.
You don't really think he looks like an ape, do you, baby? I was, thinking of changing my name to Lester.
Catherine leaped to hug him.
Oh, Daddy, it'll be so wonderful. Lester, Lester, Lester. If we had an Alice and a Bass, we'd be almost like a real family.
She stared at them.
I'd hoped to put you in a favourable frame of mind for this, Catherine, she said. You'll remember that 3 years ago the Watsons next door had wall failure and couldn't get service until morning. I invited them to watch our wall.
Dell nodded.
Haven't seen them since, now that I think of it. You haven't, but tonight Mrs. Watson is lending me her son Gerald. He's coming at 7. Mother! Catherine cried, releasing Dell. How terrible! Gerald? What a stupid name! I love Bass and you can't take him away from me. That wasn't very nice, was it, Amanda? It's done, she said. He's 22 and I want you to talk to him, Catherine.
Catherine scowled.
And I've arranged for you to go over to their house to watch Alice if you must, Dell.
Dell forgot he was indignant.
Well, Kippy, maybe this one time you can do as your mother wants, he said. Surely Bass won't mind if you miss him this once. He's an understanding sort of chap.
Catherine thought for a moment, scowling.
All right, I'll do it. If you'll call me Kippy, Mother.
Amanda studied her.
All right, Kippy,
she said finally.
After agreeing reluctantly not to call replacements until Gerald had come and gone, Kippy wriggled into a Kippy-like position and poked her finger deep into her cheek again. Gerald, who arrived promptly at 7, wore his light hair combed into a Bass-like curl low over his forehead. He speared Amanda with a penetrating stare, making her shiver as she led him to the wall room. Kippy sulked angrily on the wall seat. Amanda introduced to them, and they looked at each other, their glances revealing no interest. You're trying to comb your hair like Bass, Kippy accused. Gerald grinned. Sure thing, sweetie bug. Then you should dye it. It's the wrong colour. Bass doesn't have blonde hair. And why is your name still Gerald? Don't you ever want to be Bass? Gerald looked slapped. I tried. Honest, I really did. But you know there's a limit, and the man at the bureau said there were too many Basses already. His face brightened. But my parents call me Bass all the time. Oh. Gerald shuffled his feet. Gingerly, he sat down. Did you see them last night? He asked. Of course. I always see them, except when my mother does something stupid.
Quickly, Amanda excused herself and went to the food centre. She leaned against the counter trying to overhear their conversation. They spoke in broken murmurs momentarily, then were silent. Kippy cleared her throat irritably. Nice weather, Gerald said loudly.
I haven't been out.
They were silent again. She tried to make her fingers stop picking at a spot on the counter surface. Suddenly, Kippy emerged hurriedly from the wall room, looking put upon.
Where are you going?
Amanda demanded.
He can't talk like Bas, even when he tries. And his hair is the wrong colour, and he has blue eyes. But Catherine, Kippy, those are external characteristics. You can't judge a person by the colour of his hair and his eyes. You must get acquainted with him. I won't do it. I don't love him. I love Bas. She cocked her head Kippy-like. And besides, he loves the real Kippy. And I'll never have dimples. I'm going to call replacements.
Amanda seized her arm.
Call them, and I'll break the new wall too. I'll break every wall you bring into this house. Don't you understand what's happening? Quit being stupid. I'll break every wall you have installed. And every time you do it, I'll order a new one.
She broke loose and ran to the communicator. She had to do something. She wondered briefly, must I do something? It could only be the survival instinct driving her. Perhaps, she thought wryly, she was the only person who still possessed that particular instinct. She could never break every wall in the world, no matter how she tried. She picked up the magazine Kippy had thrown down that morning. Running her finger over the cover, she poked it through Bas's penetrating eye. She poked Kippy in the nose. She flipped the magazine open and went through it, mutilating the pages.
There's a hole in your head, Lester. One less eye for you, Alice. Poor little Kippy, I tore your chin, right through the dimple. Will Bas love you now, Kippy? Goodbye, Bas. She crumpled him into a ball and threw him at the sink. On the next page was a print of a restaurant. She read the caption. For 2 hours each evening, while filmed sequences are shown to the home audience, the stars retire to Antola's for sandwiches, drinks, and shop talk. She tried to stop her thoughts as they went to the sleeping alcove and the old gun in the top shelf of the built-ins. Dell hadn't bothered to unload it since he'd cleaned it last. She dropped the magazine and went to the top shelf of the built-ins. The gun was there. It didn't take her long to drive downtown. There were no other cars on the streets, and the current to the traffic lights had been cut 3 years before. She passed only a prowling squad car, and the 2 police stared at her curiously. She parked a block from Antola's. Leaving the car, she slung her purse, heavy with the gun, over her arm. Briskly, she walked down the deserted street. Antola, standing behind the bar, was tall, thin, and red-headed. He stared at her incredulously, wiping his hands repeatedly on his long white apron. She went past the bar to a small table. Antola continued to wipe his hands as if they would not quite come dry. You want something? Yes, bring me a bacon and tomato sandwich and milk. Don't have bacon and tomato. Kippy, she likes tuna. Bas, Hamburg. Lester and Alice, they both take grilled cheese. Which do you want? Bring me tuna and milk. Kippy, she says milk don't go with tuna. Makes a big blob inside. I said tuna and milk. Okay, if you want a blob inside. Kippy don't. He ambled away. Not knowing how long she might have to wait, she nibbled at her sandwich. Soon she heard voices approaching the restaurant. She snaked her hand toward the purse, opened it, and clutched the gun. Alice entered first, her hair a disciplined halo of red gold, her eyes vivid green. She was quarrelling with Bas, who cheerfully ignored her, his penetrating eyes staring greedily at the bottles behind the bar. Small, precocious-seeming Kippy followed, her dark hair ruffled by the wind. She stared lovingly up into Lester's eyes. When the door had closed behind them, Amanda stood and raised the gun. They hadn't noticed her. They'd been too anxious to mount the bar stools. Ducks in a shooting gallery, she thought. Alice was sitting nearer her, combing her hair with her fingers. Holding the gun out before her with both hands, Amanda aimed it at Alice's hair. She pulled the trigger. At the sound, they all tried to duck, except Alice, who folded quietly to the floor. Amanda aimed again, and this time Lester crumpled. Ducks in a shooting gallery, she thought. See if you can make that big drake bass fall off his stool. Bass fell. Kippy screamed, banishing her dimples, and fell beside him. Antola had disappeared. It didn't matter. She returned the gun to her purse. She hadn't decided what to do next. Suddenly feeling hungry, she sat down to finish her sandwich. When she was through, she rose, slung her purse over her arm again, and stepped past the 4 bodies. They hardly seemed real, lying in their separate pools of crimson. The 2 policemen came in, staring at her again. "Catch her!" Antola cried from beneath the bar. "She done it! She killed them all! Poor little Kippy!" The florid policeman locked his hand about her wrist, while the other cried for Antola to come out. Her wrists were quickly handcuffed, and the florid policeman escorted her to the police car. He shoved her into the back seat. She didn't move, didn't think. The world seemed frozen. It didn't begin to thaw again until the second squad car and the ambulances arrived. They came slowly, without sirens or flashing lights. She wondered why they came so casually. The florid policeman returned to the car. "All dead," he said. "Even poor little Kippy." Silently they drove the deserted streets. She looked out at the buildings, knowing the people inside them soon would be shocked by the news of the stars' deaths. When they reached police headquarters, she had to run to keep up with the florid policeman as he pulled her up the stone steps. They walked endless corridors, grey and gloomy, until they emerged into a small, dim room. A man in a tweed coat who smoked a pipe and spoke suavely stepped from the group of men in street clothes. "Did you kill them?" he asked. "Don't be afraid to tell me. I only want to know if you killed them." She nodded. "Certainly I did it." He took her purse from the uniformed policeman and removed the gun. "But why, tell me? Were you jealous of Alice, perhaps?" His pipe jumped as he smiled confidentially. "Certainly not," she said. "I did it to save the human race from suicide." The men smiled, amused. "Lock her up until we decide," the man in tweed instructed the florid policeman. He gave her the purse, minus the gun. A bony, disapproving matron led her to a cell and locked her into it. Amanda requested pencil and paper. The matron frowned, but brought them. Placing the paper against her purse, she began composing a statement to the press, making clear her motives. The filmed sequence still played on the small wall opposite her cell. She glanced up occasionally at the faces and smiled. She had almost completed the statement when the filmed sequence ended. The small, oily NC appeared on the wall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. She waited expectantly for the death announcement. "Our stars!" He flung out his arms dramatically. And the 4 stars pranced, smiling across the wall. Kippy, Bass, Alice, and Lester. Amanda jumped to the bars. It was not a film. "Matron!" she screamed. "Matron!" Frantically, she stared at the 4 actors whom she had murdered and who were alive and smiling. "Matron!" The bony matron unlocked the cell. "Come with me." "Matron, I killed them. I shot them." "Come with me." The matron led her into a small, dim room. The tweedy man smiled confidentially around his pipe. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Davis?" "But I murdered them. You have to keep me here."
She tried to catch the lapels of his suit. He smiled again. Who did you murder, Mrs. Davis? All of them. You know I did it. I shot them and they were all dead. He said so, the policeman. Her hands shook. Look over there, he pointed to a small wall. They're alive and performing, aren't they, Mrs. Davis? She looked at the wall. Alice and Lester were planting a small rose bush together. You see, occasionally women do suffer from delusions like yours, he said. But now that you've recovered, I'll drive you home. After a quiet night, you'll forget all this. They aren't delusions, she insisted. I did it with my husband's gun. I waited until they closed the door, then I aimed. I know I did it. Yes, certainly, he said, leading her to the door. Now come along home, Mrs. Davis. She continued to protest, but he pulled her through the corridors and down the steps to a waiting car. He nudged her into the front seat. They passed darkened buildings. She saw the neon sign atop the Herald's offices ahead. If no one knew she'd killed them, no one would awaken. No one would live again. The world would end after all. She opened the door and jumped from the moving car. Stumbling, she ran toward the Herald offices. She stumbled into the building and began seeking through its bright corridors. Stopping to stare at each office door, she finally found the one labelled Editorial Mr. Gray. She pushed into the office. The little man behind the desk wore horn-rimmed glasses and smoked a pipe that was a copy of Lester's. He smiled paternally. Yes, dear. I killed them. They're all dead. Realizing excitement did nothing to make her words more believable, she forced herself to be calm. Editor Gray wore his grey hair combed straight back, Lester-like. He stood putting one hand into his trouser pocket, as Lester always did. Who did you kill? He asked quietly. Calm down, dear. Tell me who you killed. Lester and all the rest. You have to print it. I shot them. They're dead. Print it in your paper. He crossed the room to his wall. Bass and Kippy were rolling pie dough together, one on either end of the rolling pin. I'm afraid you're imagining these things, my dear. He sucked his pipe, looking lovingly at Kippy. I could love that child, but of course Alice would be jealous. She backed away from him into the arms of the Tweedy man who had come into the office. I'm sorry to bother you, sir, he said. This poor woman is suffering from delusions. I was driving her home when she escaped me. That's all right, Editor Gray said mildly. Perhaps she needs professional help. Have you considered that, my dear? But Amanda was staring at Bass. She stared at his penetrating eyes, his broad shoulders, at the curl of hair combed low over his forehead. The curl was swirled left, not right. The Tweedy man took her arm, guided her from the building, and nudged her into the car. Do they curl a dead actor's hair differently? She wondered. She had killed them. Why weren't they dead? When they reached her house, it was completely dark. Either Dell and Kippy had gone to bed, or the wall had been replaced and was playing. I'm sorry I had to bring you away so abruptly, the Tweedy man said. We can't afford to have the press print unfavourable reports about the force, you understand? He fingered his pipe. Now, Mrs. Davis, get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow you'll realise it was all a bad dream. You wouldn't kill the stars. Woodenly, she walked up the front walk. Hearing Bass's mellow voice from the wall room, she knew Kippy and Dell were up. She entered the room. Kippy sat curled on the wall seat. Amanda stared at the handsome face on the wall. Bass McDowell, wall idol. Why wasn't he dead? His curl was still curled wrong. She looked more closely at his face as he leaned toward Kippy, gasping, Sweetie bug! There was a small scar beneath his left eye. The tiniest, most insignificant scar, but it had never been there before. Poor Bass, he looks so tired, the Kippy on the wall seat said. See how his face looks thinner when he's tired? I wonder if she notices it.
Del said, After all, Bass has worked hard today, Kippy. Bass's face was indeed thinner. Thinner face, small scar that hadn't been there before, curl that curled wrong. What did it mean? Suddenly she realized the image on the wall wasn't Bass. She corrected herself. He was a different Bass. He wasn't the one she had shot, but his almost identical double. She stared at her daughter, who looked more like Kippy each time she assumed another of her characteristics or poses. There were hundreds of young people wanting to be Bass or Kippy, hundreds of young men combing their hair the way Bass did, smiling as he did, learning to use their eyes as he did. And if the time should come when a new Bass was needed, there he was, hundreds of him. She frowned. Undoubtedly they had several doubles waiting conveniently nearby to perform if something should happen to one of the stars. She felt a choking in her throat. It would be as impossible to kill all the Basses and Kippies as it would be to break every wall in the world. There was no way to get rid of them, no way to make people listen to what was happening. No way to prevent humanity from watching itself to extinction. As they grew older, she guessed the actors would grow older too. Gradually, Bass would be 30, then 35, and Lester and the others would age too. But no one would notice. Everyone would be aging at the same rate. But someday someone would notice. Someday all the Lesters would die, and there would be no more Lester to smile at Alice and look thoughtful. And people would look around and see that her daughter Catherine was the youngest person in the world. But by then, even Catherine would be past the childbearing age. Stunned, she sat down beside Del. He squeezed her hand. She looked up at the wall, into Bass's penetrating, dark eyes. His eyes were so deep, she thought. His hands were strong, and his face was intelligent. How could she ever have hated him? "Where have you been, baby?" Del asked. She shook her head irritably. "Be quiet," she said. "Can't you see he's going to kiss her?" Perhaps she should change her name to Alice. Then they'd have Kippy, Alice and Lester. All they needed was a Bass, and they would be almost like a real family. It would be so easy to forget this way, looking deep into Bass's dark eyes. Thanks for listening to this compilation. Hit the like button and subscribe for more every Monday and Friday. And remember to check out my Patreon for exclusive novelettes by famous authors and hidden gems, as well as getting ad-free audio and video versions of all stories. That's patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF, link in the description. Staying on YouTube though, your next video could be a compilation of sci-fi stories about alien arrivals. A link to that is on screen now.